You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
University of Maryland Marching Band playing the Terrapin Fight Song, followed by their rendition of the state song, Maryland, My Maryland. I don't know how many times I've heard that over the years. My father-in-law was from Maryland, graduated from the University of Maryland, in fact. He enrolled in the University of Maryland just a few months before I was born, and he graduated when I was 4 years old. And from the time he was a college student until the time that he died a little over a year ago, he never missed a University of Maryland football game. If he wasn't there in the stadium to watch it live, he was watching it on television. And so every Saturday I can remember over at his house watching the University of Maryland football games. It's a good thing that he was not alive for the last University of Maryland football season, because I know he would have been heartbroken at the fact that the University of Maryland Marching Band was no longer playing the state song, Maryland, My Maryland. In fact, it's not escaping me the fact that I'm recording this broadcast on the day, 1 year ago, today, that I preached my father-in-law's funeral. My father-in-law's name was William Berlin, Bill Berlin. So this may seem a little awkward, especially given the content of today's program. But today's broadcast is dedicated to my late father-in-law, Bill Berlin. My father-in-law and I shared many things. One of them, of course, was our love for baseball. He had been a batting coach there in Maryland, and he'd coached baseball for a number of years. He loved the Baltimore Orioles. Another thing we shared in common was the fact that neither of us could hear Maryland, My Maryland without tearing up just a little bit. Of course, that was understandable for him. He had lived most of his life in the state of Maryland. Myself, on the other hand, that was kind of an awkward thing because I did not grow up in Maryland. I grew up in Chicago. In fact, the Baltimore Orioles kind of became my adopted American League team, if you will. I'm really a Cubs fan. I've always been a Cubs fan. But the Cubs are a National League team, so I can cheer for the Baltimore Orioles as long as they're not in the World Series playing against the Chicago Cubs. Now, with all of the interleague play in baseball, occasionally the Orioles and the Cubs will play each other. And when they do, of course, my wife and I will always have a little bit of rivalry in the house. Some years ago, I adopted the Orioles as my American League team, and my wife adopted the Cubs as her National League team. So most of the time we get along, fairly well with that arrangement. But I did not grow up in Maryland. I grew up in Chicago. Yet, for some reason, every time I hear the song Maryland, My Maryland, I tear up a little bit. There's just something about the lyrics of that great song that hits me at a heart level. It hits me at a very patriotic level. I think that Maryland, My Maryland is probably one of the most patriotic songs that's ever been written in the history of our country. And now that song is under attack. Back in August, Heritage Newsletter, that the University of Maryland would no longer be playing the song at their events, at their sporting events. and at their university and campus events. And that was just a tragedy. Last year we also reported that there was some movement in the Maryland legislature. There was some movement in the Maryland legislature in 2016 to eliminate the state song of Maryland. Fortunately, those measures did not go anywhere. However, the left, if they are anything, they are persistent, and they've brought these things up yet again. And so now the Maryland State Legislature has before it two bills. One is House Bill 508, the other being House Bill 608. House Bill 508 would say that the Maryland state song should be eliminated, that the state of Maryland should have a contest, God forbid. Do you remember a few years back when Virginia decided to get rid of its state song and they had a contest? Remember what a disaster that was? Well, House Bill 508 would do the same thing in Maryland and have a contest to determine the new state song. House Bill 608, which is also before the state legislature, would have not a contest, but would simply quietly revise and rewrite the song, eliminating what it calls the offensive language of the song. And it would form a committee that would rewrite the words of the song. And I'll just say it, from what I can tell, the plans of the committee, if it should go anywhere, would be to use the proposal of 2016, which would have gutted the song of everything except for its third verse. And even that would have become a ballad, if you will, a commemoration to Harriet Tubman, because I guess it's not enough that they're putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Now they want to make the state song of Maryland all about her as well. Normally I would say that these actions aren't going to gain any traction, because I know that in the past the governor has said that he opposed the idea of getting rid of Maryland, My Maryland as the state song. It's probably a political hot potato that he just doesn't want to touch. I believe that the timing of these two House measures are a convergence, the perfect storm, if you will. And I believe that in this legislative session that we are probably going to see a serious and a drastic change to the Maryland state song. I do not believe that House Bill 508 will be passed. I do believe it will get out of committee. I believe the legislature will debate it vigorously and then use opposing it as the pretext to pass House Bill 608, thus allowing them to radically rewrite the lyrics to the song. So in today's broadcast, we want to get ahead of that. We want to get ahead of the efforts in Maryland to destroy their state song. Our guest today is Joyce Bennett. Joyce is the author of the book Maryland, My Maryland, The Cleansing of a Small Southern State. She's a historian from the state of Maryland. Her book, published by Shotwell Publishing, who, by the way, is one of our advertisers and sponsors in our Dixie Heritage newsletter, talks about the cultural cleansing that's taking place in the state of Maryland and how the eradication and changing of the state song would be a overall part of that program. I called Joyce earlier today, and we spoke on the phone and we talked about several things. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to cut to that phone call. But first, a word from our sponsor, The Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading The Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading The Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In The Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Hello, Miss Joyce. This is Ed DeVries with Dixie Heritage.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. You are the author of the book Maryland, My Maryland?
Maryland, My Maryland, the cultural cleansing of a small southern state.
What exactly is your book about?
How Maryland's culture, as the title implies, how it's been cleansed, eradicated. I talk about, first of all, our history. Our history has been rewritten or ignored. That is the truth about it. I look at the culture, the language, the way we speak, our expressions. I look at our manners, even our cuisine, shifting demographic. We have lots of folks move here because of the federal government. They work in D.C. That's a problem both Maryland and Virginia have.
You had said that Maryland had a unique language or a unique speech. What exactly did you mean by that?
Maryland is located in the Upper South. In fact, a lot of people don't know. And our speech is, you very seldom hear the real speech of Maryland because all the new folks moving in. For example, where I live, St. Mary's County, we have a lot of people who speak in a way that's similar to the folks in the Outer Banks or Andrew Island, Virginia. There's some similarities there.
I'll say I experienced that recently. I was preaching at a church in Westminster, Maryland, and I noticed how many of the people in the church, especially the young people, had a very southern-sounding accent.
Well, that's encouraging if the younger folks had it, because one of my concerns is that, we're losing those. Western Maryland is different, Southern Maryland, and they're both different from the speech of the Eastern Shore. And, in the Chesapeake region, there are hundreds of dialects, and it's fascinating. It's kind of hard to sort it all out. But it is was not traditionally a northern way of speaking. Not many of us do speak in the old way.
My wife is from Maryland, and she grew up there, and now we live in Florida, and she will be talking to someone at the grocery store, at the shopping mall. We could be anywhere, and she could hear somebody, and she'll go up to them, and she'll ask them if they're from a certain part of Maryland, and usually she'll be correct based on...
Yes, I'm not the least bit surprised at that. Where's she from? Which part of Maryland?
She's from Bowie.
Those folks are true Marylanders, I've no doubt.
You had said that the history of Maryland has been in the process of being rewritten.
Well, for example, some of the legislators in Annapolis are trying to either get rid of the state song entirely or changing the lyrics. And they don't like the lyrics because the lyrics tell the truth about what happened in Maryland during the war between the states. If you're going to lie about what happened in Maryland during that war, and Maryland played a very important role, you can't have the state song's lyrics telling the truth about what happened, because that's inconvenient for the people who are lying about Maryland history. So the attempt to change the state song is an attempt to revise history. To read an article in the Washington Post or Washington Times, no better, and they say the most outlandish things about Maryland's history, particularly about the what they call the Civil War. I mean, just uninformed. In general, they seem to be uninformed.
Well, I'm not from Maryland. I'm from Chicago originally. And I had a little bit of a journey in life going from being a Yankee born in Chicago to being an advocate for Southern heritage. Of course, part of that was in discovering that I had Confederate ancestry, but it even went way before that when I came to the conclusion as a history teacher that the South was right in my study of the Civil War, and that really put me on a journey. The song Maryland, My Maryland has just always hit me at a gut level, at a heart level. I mean, so much so that even though I often joked that we had it played for the sake of my father-in-law or my soon-to-be father-in-law, the truth was I chose the song because it's always spoken to me at a heart level.
Yes.
At my wife and I's wedding ceremony, they played Maryland, My Maryland while she walked down the aisle.
Oh, that's wonderful. That was a lovely thing to do.
Yep. So the song has always hit me at a heart level. The lyrics are just amazing. 9 verses to the song. I know most people probably don't realize that the state song has 9 verses.
I know they don't. In fact, I was well into adulthood before I ever realize that even in Maryland schools you don't learn. And, you know, James Ryder Randall's words are poetry. There was a poem and absolutely beautiful. So it is probably the best state song there is. And it was called the Marseillaise of the South. Lots of Southern troops sang and played Maryland, My Maryland.
Would you mind if we go through the 9 verses of Maryland, My Maryland, and you just break down their meaning for us?
I can. Yes, go ahead.
I sing horribly, so we're going to let the 97th Pennsylvania String Band sing this for us. Here's the first verse.
The despot's heel is on thy shore, Maryland, my Maryland. His touch is at thy temple door, Maryland, my Maryland. Avenge the patriotic gore that fleck the streets of Baltimore, and be the battle queen of yore, Maryland, my Maryland.
Yes, that's about Lincoln. Lincoln is a despot, and it's talking about, well, quite frankly, the invasion and occupation of Maryland, and it began for 1861. Some people call it the Riot of Baltimore. I call it the Battle of Baltimore. It is the first bloodshedding of the war between the states.
That was specifically when Lincoln was attempting to jail the legislature to prevent them from voting for secession?
No, that was months. No, that was months later.
Okay.
The opening gambit in the invasion of Maryland was in April of 1861, and Lincoln began to occupy the state then, and it proceeded, and by summer, early summer, it was pretty much done. And then, but the arresting of the legislators rather did not happen until September of that year.
And then the second verse.
Hark to a wandering son's appeal, Maryland, my Maryland, my mother's state, to thee I kneel, Maryland, my Maryland, for life and death, for woe and weal, thy peerless chivalry reveal, and gird thy beauteous limbs with steel, Maryland, my Maryland.
James Ryder Randall is living in Louisiana, and he was teaching, I believe, at a college. And that's when he got the news about Baltimore. And he actually mistakenly, I believe, thought a friend of his had died, but he had not. He was just wounded. I'm begging you, my dear mother, Maryland, get ready and fight, fight against the invaders. Marylanders and Louisianians were very closely connected because they were Southern and Catholic. And many Marylanders went to Louisiana, and then Louisianians lived in Maryland or married people who were from Maryland. Anyway, that's what that one was about.
Third verse.
Thou wilt not cower in the dust, Maryland, my Maryland. Thy beaming sword shall never rust, Maryland, my Maryland. Remember Carroll's sacred trust, remember Howard's warlike thrust, and all thy slumbers with the just, Maryland, my Maryland.
Carroll signed the Declaration of Independence, and that's a reference to him. Howard is a very old family name. He is a great military hero in Maryland history.
And then the fourth verse, come 'tis the red dawn of the day, come with thy panoplied array, with Ringgold's spirit for the fray, with Watson's blood at Monterey, with fearless Low and dashing May, Maryland, my Maryland.
There's a reference there to the Mexican War, the mentioning of Monterey, Ringgold.
And then the fifth verse.
Come, for thy shield is bright and strong, Maryland, my Maryland. Come, for thy dalliance does thee wrong, Maryland, my Maryland. Come to thine own heroic throng that stalks with liberty along, and give a new key to thy song, Maryland, my Maryland.
And thy song is Maryland's sister southern state. And thy dalliance does thee wrong. In other words, Maryland, what's wrong with you? It's time to join the fray with your sister southern state. Maryland and Virginia both, and this is true of the whole Upper South, and this is where knowing real history is so important. The whole Upper South was hesitant to secede. Robert E. Lee opposed. He only chose to serve Virginia because when she seceded, not because he loved secession, but he loved his country, Virginia, and that's why he resigned his commission in the U.S. Army. The Upper South kind of was hesitant. The Deep South was a little more, we considered it hasty in the Upper South. When Lincoln started throwing his weight around, we came around, but for poor little Maryland, it was too late.
The next verse specifically, "Dear mother, burst the tyrant's chain, Virginia should not call in vain."
Dear mother, burst the tyrant's chain, Maryland, my Maryland, Virginia should not call in vain, Maryland, my Maryland. She meets her sisters on the plain, sic semper 'tis the proud refrain that baffles minions back amain, Maryland, my Maryland.
Again, you're going to join with Virginia, and, get this done. She's calling to you.
Verse 7.
I see the blush upon thy cheek, Maryland, my Maryland, but thou wast ever bravely meek, Maryland, my Maryland. But lo, there surges forth a shriek, from hill to hill, from creek to creek, Potomac calls to Chesapeake, Maryland, my Maryland.
Yes, the blush upon her cheek means you ought to be a little ashamed. It's a gentle chastising type of thing. Potomac calls to Chesapeake. Potomac is a reference to Virginia, and Chesapeake is a reference to Maryland. It's saying Virginia's calling.
So was it a rebuke that Maryland had not yet seceded?
Rebuke was a strong word. He is saying to his mother, Maryland, which he loves very much, outraged at what had happened in Baltimore. And so he's saying, Virginia, don't let her call in vain. Self together and join the fight. Remember, it was quite early in the conflict. Virginia had not even seceded at this point.
Okay.
But he's assuming she's going to.
And then in the 8th verse,
Thou wilt not yield the Vandal toll, Maryland, my Maryland. Thou wilt not crook to his control, Maryland, my Maryland. Better the fire upon thee roll, better the blade, the shot, the bowl, than crucifixion on the soul, Maryland, my Maryland.
Yeah, this one's my favorite. Better the blade, better the fire upon the roll, better the blade, the shot, the bowl, than crucifixion of the soul. In other words, it's better to die in battle for honor and for what is just than to be safe, but at the mercy of this vandal. Those who are vandalizing our state, who have tramped across our state, the vandals that have invaded us.
And then the last verse, I hear the distant thunder hum.
I hear the distant thunder hum, Maryland, my Maryland. The old line bugle, fife and drum, Maryland, my Maryland. She is not dead, nor deaf, nor dumb. Huzzah, she spurns the northern scum. She breathes, she burns, she'll come, she'll come. Maryland, my Maryland.
Yes, that is a reference to the old line, Maryland. The old line, Marylanders really performed quite well in the Revolutionary War. And it was, the Maryland line was famous. And they were really wonderful soldiers. And Marylanders were credited, I think you can make the case for the victory for single-handedly holding off, which seems like the entire British Army in New York at the Battle of the Old Stone House near Brooklyn. The Maryland 400 took a stand there and allowed Washington to retreat across the swamp. thereby saving the American Army for another day. But anyway, that is a reference to the valor of the Maryland's Revolutionary War soldiers, and you need to get with them, have their spirit. And of course, the Northern scum speaks for itself. Those are the Yankee invaders.
Well, how could anyone in Maryland think themselves to be in a northern state when the very state song spurns the Northern scum?
Bless your heart. You hit the old nail on the head. What you do is you change the state song. Because people will ask the very question you just asked.
Well, I know that there's a House bill in progress right now, House Bill 608, that wants to do just that it wants to change the state song, specifically eliminating verse 10 and other verses that it basically declares to be, quote-unquote, objectionable.
Yes.
And if I understand House Bill 608 correctly, it's pretty much going to limit the state song to a single verse, being verse 3, and verse 3 is even going to be modified.
Yes, even that one they won't leave alone. They're going to get rid of the reference to Howard. They won't even leave the stanza alone that they are going to use. And they may succeed. They've tried, they periodically try this. Somehow, miraculously, we've survived. Our song has survived. Unlike Virginia's and...
Well, there is another House bill in proposal as well right now, and it's House Bill 508.
Yes.
And House Bill 508 calls for having a contest to come up with a totally brand new song.
Yes, I saw that. That seems a little silly.
Right. Now, of course...
The whole thing.
You mentioned Virginia, and Virginia had a contest to choose its new state song, and that was an absolute disaster.
It was, and that is really heartbreaking because I love the Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. And there is such madness afoot that even the word Virginia is considered offensive. This is madness. This is how a civilization dies.
Well, let me explain to you what I think is going to happen in Maryland, and you can tell me if you think that I'm right or wrong.
All righty.
I think that certain politicians in Maryland will allow House Bill 508 to get out of committee, and it will be vigorously debated in the state assembly, not because they have any intention of passing it, but because ultimately they intend to oppose it. They're going to be in opposition to changing the state song. And then what they'll do is they'll pass House Bill 608 claiming that they're saving the state song. And just hope that the citizens of Maryland don't catch on to the fact that they'll be rewriting the words in the process.
Yeah, that's a pretty good guess. That's the way their minds work.
And so the reason that they couldn't pass various versions of House Bill 608 in the past was because it called attention to all the changes. But this time, they'll be able to pass it because they'll pass it under the guise of saving the state song rather than of changing it.
Yes, they're very, for lack of a better way to say it, the cultural Marxists are very clever people. They're not good or wise people, but that doesn't mean they're not clever. So they're good at manipulation, so they would probably attempt something very similar.
Do you think that the typical person in the state of Maryland would even notice the changes?
Sadly, no. Although some of us have been trying to, wake people up. You get some very odd reactions when you stick up for the state's history and culture. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, a lot of times people get angry, which I find curious.
Angry at what?
If I were to say, for example, that if I were from Massachusetts and I were to say to my fellow Massachusetts citizens, Massachusetts is a southern state, well, everybody would laugh and people would say, poor old thing, she's not right. But you say it about Maryland and people say, well, that's not true, are you crazy? Or, they get aggravated, they get mad. I just think that's curious. And I think it's because they are running up against these reminders of Maryland's true past. It's not just a song. The reminders are everywhere.
We'll get into that in just a minute, but first, a word from another one of our sponsors, the American Free Press. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news. And folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
And it is now post time for the Preakness.
Now assembled in the Cupola Winners Circle are members of the United States Naval Academy Glee Club under the direction of Monty Maxwell to sing Maryland, My Maryland.
Thou wilt not cower in the dust, Maryland, my Maryland, thy gleaming sword will never rust. Maryland, my Maryland, remember Carroll's sacred trust, remember Howard's warlike cross, and all thy slumbers with the just. Maryland, my
Wonderful women and men who represent our country, United States Naval Academy, just about 40 miles south of here in beautiful Annapolis, Maryland, with the traditional singing of the state song as the horses now get set to parade in front of the grandstand here at Pimlico for the 142nd Preakness Stakes.
So what other reminders are there in Maryland of the Southern culture and history and heritage of the state?
Even our flag is a stylized cross of St. Andrew, if you look at it. Lee Jackson Memorial in Baltimore. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to see that, but it was a magnificent memorial. It was dedicated it was 1948, I believe, possibly 49. It was either one of those 2 years. And in the dead of night, a few months ago, it was removed, very sadly. So that was a reminder. Well, you drive around St. Mary's County, and you'll still see Confederate battle flags waving. So it lives in the hearts of a lot of Maryland people. We have chapters of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And of course, I'm drawing a blank, but there are other monuments, or were monuments in Baltimore to Confederate soldiers and sailors, and I think some of the women involved in the war. By the way, there's some real famous Maryland women who aided the South during the war. Rose O'Neal Greenhouse was known as Rebel Rose, and she was credited by Jefferson Davis with helping the South win First Manassas. And there were other women, who aided the Southern cause. There was a Euphemia Goldsborough, who was also a nurse. She was just loved by Confederate prisoners she took care of. She went to Gettysburg at the time of that battle, and she went to the makeshift hospital the Yankees had for the Southern wounded, and they were POWs, obviously, and she helped them. She took care of George Patton's great uncle, who was hemorrhaging to death, and she sat up, she put her back to his and sat up all night, because they had no furniture, he was on the floor, and she sat up all night with her back to him. They were back to back to keep him from suffocating, because he was hemorrhaging in the lungs. And she sat there all night, and he did die in the morning, but she did that to keep him alive. So she was quite an heroic woman. So we have all these wonderful, true Maryland heroes and heroines that present a problem. By the way, in the school books that teach children about Maryland history, they don't tell you about these women. Or they tell you about Clara Barton, who was from New England. They call her a Marylander. She lived in Maryland for a few years.
So why do you think they omit the references to the heroines of Maryland?
Because it tells the truth about the fact that Maryland was a southern state that was invaded and occupied by Abraham Lincoln, because it was an important state strategically. Geographically, it was important. Baltimore was important. Oh, a lot of people will say, all these men from Maryland served the Union Army. And they say the same thing about people from New Orleans. A whole lot of people from New Orleans served in the Yankee Army. But both New Orleans and Baltimore were occupied cities. The Yankees had an opportunity. They would recruit the Germans and Irish immigrants at these ports, and they would literally step off the boat and into the Union Army. And many of them were starving. They were very hungry. It's really sad. These boys just wanted to eat, so they would join in the Union Army. And they didn't. They had no interest in. They had no more interest in freeing the slaves than Lincoln's men, who were not fighting to free the slaves. That is a myth. And Lincoln was fighting to preserve the tariff.
Was Maryland strategic in any way for the Union, or do you think that it was just simply a matter that Lincoln did not want to lose another state?
No, Maryland was extremely important because, again, D.C. is surrounded by Maryland, at least not on all sides. Some of it was Virginia. In other words, the capital was right within Maryland, and Washington, D.C., a little-known fact, is that's the Mason-Dixon. By the way, it was a southern city. The people, there was a strong secessionist population there. They wanted to hold on to the nation's capital. Obviously, they didn't want to lose Maryland, which is right there and in close proximity. That's why they also occupied parts of Virginia. Not a lot, but parts of it. So that was a great concern.
So what inspired you to write the book Maryland, My Maryland?
Because I'd spent decades researching the history of Maryland, and I also wrote essays, freelance writer. I don't publish many essays, very few, but I did write a few essays, and then I sort of took the themes I developed in those essays, and I expanded them, and I wrote more essays. I said, well, someone has to make the case for our being a southern state, and that something really precious is being lost. That is our southern heritage and culture. And there are some history books that are wonderful. They really tell you the true history of the state. The Southern Star from Maryland is one, and Maryland the South's First Casualty is another. So for the history, they're really wonderful. But I also, in the book, talk about culture and language, cuisine. I also touch on race relations, and I kind of tell things the way they are. It's the way I look at history is you simply record, chronicle what happened, and you do honest research and let the chips fall where they may. And I say history should be looked at, warts and all. A people's history should be examined, warts and all. The good stuff, the bad stuff, you just lay it out there. There are people who believe you can't know the truth about history, but of course you can through diligent research. And when you don't know something, you simply say you don't know.
So what were race relations like in Maryland leading up to the war between the states?
Well, leading up to the war between the states, just a typical upper South state with, there were lots of tobacco planters in Maryland, and there was slavery. Obviously, slavery is it's an immoral thing. It's evil. No human being has the right to own another human being. But then the French, the British, Arabs, sub-Saharan Africans themselves have all enslaved other people, and mankind is guilty of having done this. But, for example, Britain and France freed their slaves without a genocidal war. It wasn't necessary for that to happen in the United States. So slavery obviously is not a good thing, but it did exist. But 50% of those of African descent living in Maryland were free. So I think it was, abolition was happening. Obviously not fast enough for those in bondage. Unspeakable to have to live in bondage. But there was slavery, in the North as well. And
I might be taking you outside of your areas of expertise, but the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln could have, but specifically chose not to free the slaves in Maryland.
Right. He didn't free the slaves in the occupied South. For one thing, he was trying to please the planters by leaving it intact. But it was a war measure. It was, it was a mission change. Mission creep, I guess you'd call it today. You start a war in the Middle East for one reason, and halfway through it you come up with something else, and that's what it was. He sent the Star of the West down to Charleston Harbor to reinforce the fort there so that it could collect the tariffs. He did not send the Star of the West down to Charleston to free anyone, to free one man, woman, or child held in bondage. It was an economic war.
But even when Lincoln made the pretense of freeing the slaves in Virginia or Mississippi, he refused to do so in Maryland. Is that a fact that's lost on the black people of Maryland, or are they still very aware of it?
you are right there. I'm not as well versed in that. I simply know that the proclamation was issued in 1863, and that one of the things he hoped was it would cause insurrection in the Confederacy. So that's about all I know about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Do you think that these attacks against the culture of Maryland, the changing of the state song, the removal of the statues in Baltimore, the non-Confederate related attacks against Chief Justice Taney because of his role in the Dred Scott decision, are these connected, or do you think that they're non-connected? Are they connected?
I believe Taney freed any slaves he had, and I believe he was anti-slavery, but he ruled, he thought, strictly constitutionally. Now, should the Constitution perhaps have been amended? Yes. Oh, yes, it should have been amended. But at the time, it was ruling constitutionally. But yes, his statute is considered offensive too.
Right. And now they want to change the state song. Are all of these attacks against the history and culture of Maryland, are they connected? Or in other words, is this an organized war, or are these just individual politicians and individual activists?
Well, go ahead.
I guess I'm trying to get your opinion on whether this is a concerted effort or if these are just individual attacks that are starting to pile up on one another.
I don't want to sound like an alarmist. I'm really not. But I think it's cultural Marxism, and I mean, it simply is something that there's an impetus. It's just a growing. For example, if you do change the Maryland state song, then there will be more demand. It seems to feed on itself until all symbols that people consider offensive are gone, and who knows where that will stop. So it's sort of a thing that feeds on itself, and the political correctness is an evil. It is. In a free society, you're going to be offended sometimes. And I think also this is a large factor. The federal government has too much power. And the South, the Confederacy, and the border states understood that the state is sovereign, that the federal government should be the servant of the states, the agent of the state. And when Lincoln acted dictatorially, he especially concerned the Upper South. When he made aggressive moves, the state had a right to terminate the Union, dissolve the Union. It was a voluntary agreement, and they had a right to leave. They believed in the principle of subsidiarity, that a government closest to the people is best. And as the founders of the country understood, they understood that when you give the federal government too much power, too many responsibilities, shall we say, no matter how well-intentioned those responsibilities, it grows too powerful and can ultimately corrupt and ultimately tyrannical. Federal government today has too much power, and I think that enforces political correctness, and that contributes to cultural cleansing.
Well, when you look at the state song of Maryland, you could tell that there was a heartbeat of liberty that at one time prevailed in that state. Just like, the state of Virginia, their state motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, the fact that the Declaration of Independence was written by a Virginian. There was a heartbeat of liberty in that state that I would dare say is probably close to extinguished now. Delaware had that heartbeat of liberty at some point because their state motto was live free or die. You look at the words of the state song of Maryland, the despot's heel is on thy shore, or Sic Semper 'tis the proud refrain, avenge the patriotic gore that flecked the streets of Baltimore. That heartbeat of liberty was beating in Maryland at one point. Is it still there? Is it dying? Is it dead?
Well, it is still beating, but there's a remnant of Marylanders, I think, cherished liberty and cherished their heritage. A remnant of it. Sometimes I think that the solution might be for some of the counties to secede from Maryland. Our state constitution allows for that. There's a process.
That's
In fact,
interesting.
the Eastern Shore attempted in the 90s to do that. They considered it.
Did they actually vote to withdraw or no?
I forget if it. I don't know if it came to a referendum on ballot referendum, and I'm not up on exactly what you got to do, but I think you have to have a certain number of folks, and I do believe you have to do it in cooperation with the legislature. In fact, I know you do. If you become an independent state, let's say counties break off of a state, they cannot be admitted to the union as a new state unless the parent state gives permission. And by the way, West Virginia is not legally the state, but that's a topic for another day. I love West Virginia. Even Lincoln said it's not quite legal because the parent state has to get permission for West Virginia to join the union, or has to approve the separation. I think that was
right. Is there anything that we should have talked about that we haven't?
I think it's wonderful, and if I can help by being in an interview, it makes me very happy. I love my state, and I want to see the state song remain the same. So I'm appreciative of any help that you can lend.
How does someone get a hold of a copy of your book?
It's on Amazon, and it's available in the Kindle version as well. It's published by Shotwell Publishing,
Okay.
Columbia, South Carolina.
We're familiar with them. They're actually a advertiser in our newsletter.
Yeah, they're very fine publishing house, and they've got a lot of real interesting titles now. People ought to check them out on Reconstructed History and other things that they offer. So it's really good place.
So are you involved in any groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy or any Maryland organizations?
I am a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I'm descended from 2 Confederate soldiers, one from Virginia and one from Maryland. I'm very proud of that affiliation.
Tell me a little bit about how your Confederate ancestor from Maryland came to serve in the Confederacy.
Well, he served in the Virginia Infantry. Now, his records are a little shadowy because Marylanders were very closed-mouthed about their, the Confederate service of their husbands and brothers and sons, because we were occupied by Union troops. I mean, they were here, and my great grandfather, William Martin Weibel, for some reason came back after serving in the infantry. I don't have all the details. I didn't claim him as my ancestor when I joined UDC. I claimed the other one. But we believe he ran the blockade because he was a captain, a steamboat captain.
Okay.
Or I don't know, maybe with sail. But anyway, he went up and down the Potomac. Union soldiers came to his house. My grandmother tells me they searched her grandfather's house and top to bottom, and they were looking for things because he was suspected. They were looking for contraband. There was a very, very strong Confederate underground in Maryland, and so we think he was part of that. The other one is from Virginia, William H. Nash. I got his record, so I was able to use him as my ancestor to get into UDC. But I claim both, even though I don't know as much about William Martin Weibel. But I think he's kind of colorful. A blockade runner is kind of an interesting, very proud of that. I don't know if I have any more.
Breaker one, breaker one. Might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
Here's a song that was taken from the old classic German melody Tannenbaum. It's also known as Maryland, My Maryland, and we're here now from our Dixieland boys. Johnny Klein, roll it off.
That was a classic. That was a video from 1957 from the Lawrence Welk Show. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. But I can assure all of our listeners that we at Dixie Heritage are going to be doing everything that we can to oppose this changing of the state song of Maryland, to oppose the changing of the words to Maryland, My Maryland. We're going to be actively lobbying the state legislature and the governor of the state of Maryland to keep their great traditional state song. I want to encourage you to go to the Shotwell Publishing website, look at all their wonderful books that they offer there, especially the book that was written by our guest today, Maryland, My Maryland. It's a great read. You'll enjoy it thoroughly. Also want you to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. www.dixieheritage.net. Sign up for our newsletter. It's absolutely free. When you do, I will also send you a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Again, no cost, no obligation. We just want to put the information in your hand. Use the contact form. Shoot me an email. I read each and every one of them personally. Let me know who you are and that you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour. And if you're specifically interested in what you can do to help preserve the state song of Maryland, let us know that as well, and we'll keep you informed. Until next week, God bless. And so now I'm going to leave you with Bobby Horton and the CSA Strings singing Maryland, My Maryland.
Despot's heel is on my shore, Maryland, my Maryland. His torches at thy temple door, Maryland, my Maryland. Avenge the patriotic gore that flecked the streets of Baltimore, and be the battle queen of your Maryland, my Maryland. Dear mother, burst the tyrant's chain, Maryland, my Maryland. Virginia should not call in vain, Maryland, my Maryland. She meets her sisters on sic semper 'tis the proud refrain that baffles minions back amain. Maryland, my Maryland, I hear the distant thunder hum. Maryland, my Maryland, the old line's bugle, fife and drum. Maryland, my Maryland, she is not dead, nor deaf, nor dumb. Huzzah, she spurns the northern scum. She breathes, she burns, she'll come, she'll come.